Higher education is in a state of flux, not only in South Africa. Globally, nationally and locally, we're seeing increasing calls for transformation, for responsiveness to 21st century realities. This has meant, among many other things, the restructuring and alignment of qualification frameworks and the interrogation of what kind of graduates we need to produce, given the impact of globalization and rapid technological developments. As higher education practitioners, never have we had to juggle more balls. We are required to teach classes that get bigger and more diverse every year. We need to design or deliver curricula that are bulging at the seams as we try to bridge the articulation gap by stretching backwards and make those curricula more relevant by weaving forwards to face the world of work and increasingly complex societies. We are expected, like our students, to engage in lifelong learning by increasing our own qualification levels, by conducting meaningful research and producing outputs. These responsibilities mean engaging with various communities of practice, not the least of which is the very community in which our institutions are located. We are called upon to reach out and engage with those around us so as to contribute to socio-economic transformation. Recent research on wellness in higher education academics indicates alarming symptoms of burnout. Many of us here, I'm sure, have felt or are feeling the increasing effects of the stress. Maybe we're even beginning to drop the ball. What I would like to do today is to share with you a view of all those balls we are juggling that can change the way we work. In talking about the diverse roles of higher education institutions, Badat refers to the view of teaching and learning, research and community engagement as related and intersecting activities. I'd like to take that a step further and suggest that each of these functions can contribute to the others. I'm going to be doing three things. Firstly, we're going to take a brief look at higher education in 21st century South Africa. Secondly, I'm going to give you an overview of my own PhD research on problem solving, and then demonstrate how the principles of the research are enacted in my daily work and supported by the effective use of a number of very practical tools. I wonder how many of us sit in those endless departmental or faculty meetings thinking, this is such a waste of my time. I have papers to mark, a class to prepare for, a proposal to write. Now, just as many of us are engaged in redesigning curricula that are appropriate to a super complex world, to quote Barnett, so too our institutions are battling to balance their own super complexities. Salim Badat describes the purpose of universities as the production of knowledge, its dissemination, the cultivation of the cognitive character of students, and playing a role in our communities. So, we have duties with respect to the knowledge, practices, and values of the programs in which we work, of our students, of our communities, and of our own development. These epistemological, ontological, and praxis dimensions of our work are very different in those different spaces. The knowledge I teach in the subject I'm responsible for is totally different from the knowledge in my administrative role or the knowledge required in a particular community project. So too, the practices differ considerably. The rigor of doing a scientific experiment is not the same as opening up a space for creative community discussion. Manuel Castells tells us that universities are subject to the conflicts and contradictions of society and need to be solid and dynamic enough to stand the tensions that will necessarily trigger the simultaneous performance of somewhat contradictory functions. Now, in our attempt to balance these contradictory functions, and in the face of consistent challenges with throughput, attrition, and retention, our institutions have resorted to increasingly managerialist approaches to managing what it is we do. This is a form of top-down management. Now, while these approaches, drawn from the private sector, may be intended to guide or quality assure practices in the sector, I'm sure that everyone in this room has experienced that sinking feeling when yet another checklist or audit-type document or process has popped into your inbox. They represent yet another duty in our already full workloads, the first of 4 occupational stresses among South African academics. We often feel these processes rob us of the little time we have to do meaningful work, and it's no wonder that we just tick the boxes to keep someone up there happy. Another key contributor to occupational stress among South African academics is job control, in addition to lack of resources, poor communication systems, and the actual characteristics of our jobs. And yet, ironically, we're still expected to be innovative. Now let's just take a look at innovation. One of the mentors on my postgraduate journey, Dr. Keith Jacobs, looked at what it took for engineering enterprises to be innovative and to develop viable new products in South Africa. At the heart of his model is what he calls the innovation engine. And for this to exist, staff need to be empowered. They need to be trusted to have responsibility. They need to work in an organization that is flexible, adaptable, and with open communication channels. Working under such conditions boosts morale and improves productivity and creativity. Now, the low morale and state of staff health at many of our institutions suggests that the conditions required for innovation and success simply do not exist. I would hazard a guess that my colleagues here feel they are constantly walking a tightrope between conflicting paradigms. Now, what seems to be missing in our contradictory roles is a guiding conceptual framework. To quote your very own Vice-Chancellor, who alludes to this in his collaborative paper on the strategic transformation of education programs at your institution, Central University of Technology. Now, the good news is that this balancing act is exactly what we expect of our students. This is the nature of balancing different kinds of knowledge, practices, and values that characterize their lives as students preparing for legitimate socioeconomic participation. But knowing this doesn't make it any easier to accomplish. So I'm going to take you on a research detour to demonstrate the underlying guiding conceptual framework that frames what such a balancing act really looks like in the world of engineering practice. The impetus for my research was the observation that University of Technology engineering students struggle to bridge the theory-practice divide, and that this is particularly evident in the design or project subjects, and even more acute when they are trainees in industry. As a work-integrated learning coordinator, among other roles, at the time, I kept hearing industry partners talking about students not knowing the principles or not being hands-on. Now, the original contention in my research was that we do not fully understand the complexity of a problem-solving situation in the 21st century, particularly in the face of dynamic and evolving technologies, in relation to a relatively stable body of science-based knowledge. So I set out to look at how engineering practitioners apply different engineering disciplines in a real-world problem in different industrial contexts. So the aim was to understand what this disciplinary navigation looked like, so that we're able to look back at the curriculum and our teaching and shape it more appropriately for the 21st century. Now, the research is theoretically located in the sociology of education and draws on the work of 2 key social realists, Basil Bernstein and Carl Mayton's legitimation code theory. I looked at the relationship between the different core disciplines underpinning multidisciplinary engineering their different knowledge structures or organizing principles. The fact that on their own, which we tend to teach in silos, these disciplines require different ways of thinking. And I wanted to understand what it meant when these different disciplines come together in a problem-solving moment. Now let's just take a look at some of these organizing principles. The engineering region at the heart of my research is mechatronics engineering, which is the computer control of electromechanical systems, the kind of engineering you find in manufacturing. Now its core disciplines are physics, mathematics, and logic. I've arranged the key elements of a mechatronics curriculum as a Venn diagram to demonstrate the disciplinary spread. Now in Bernsteinian terms, here on the right we have the traditional physics-based engineering regions, mechanical and electrical. These are regions underpinned by physics, what Bernstein terms a hierarchical knowledge structure. We have specific concepts strongly sequenced that absorb lower concepts. Ohm's law is an example, or force. Now, in the center, and applying across the spectrum, is mathematics, which is a strong horizontal knowledge structure. This simply means that there are different mathematical languages which you could apply to the same phenomenon. Each language has strongly recognizable concepts or rules that are not necessarily applicable to a different mathematical language. Now, the upper left are regions that are underpinned by logic, the disciplinary basis of programming and control systems. Now, this is a weak horizontal knowledge structure. Weak meaning that there are choices that are context dependent, like languages themselves or social science. In other words, the phenomenon itself does not dictate the knowledge form in the way that motion is governed by Newton's laws or voltage is governed by Ohm's law. These kinds of knowledge are weak in that they borrow concepts and rules across families of the same type. They're constantly changing. Things become redundant. Now, each of these structural knowledge types requires an entirely different way of thinking, of learning even. They represent a different kind of code, and we tend to teach them in silos in their specific subject streams. But the question is, how do engineering practitioners work with such very different forms of knowledge at the same time? The analytical tool used to look at the problem-solving moment comes from one of the legitimation code theory dimensions, specialization. Specifically, the concept of epistemic relations. This is about the what and the how of knowledge. Now, the vertical axis is about the phenomenon in question, how strongly it is bounded by recognizable and legitimate principles. The horizontal axis is about ways of approaching the phenomenon. The stronger the rules, the stronger the so-called discursive relations. Now, the epistemic plane gives us 4 codes, 4 ways of thinking. The top right is purist, recognized principles and associated procedures, precisely like Ohm's law. Doesn't matter what language you speak or where you live, the principle of the relationship between current, voltage, and resistance is consensually accepted. The bottom right is recognized methodologies. Doesn't matter what the phenomenon is. This is like following a formula, the structure of an experiment, applying lean manufacturing rules, mathematics, or economics. The top left quadrant is called situational insight. There are many possibilities for addressing the same strongly bounded phenomenon. Choosing a new cell phone, for example. What I want to do is fixed, but how I do it is variable. I have a range of choices to choose from. The lower left quadrant is where there isn't a strongly bounded phenomenon or any fixed ways to do things. This could either be because now we're not focused on knowledge, but are knowers where different or other things count, or because there is no legitimate or recognizable practice, there isn't a strongly bounded phenomenon that all understand or adhere to, or recognizable procedures through which we can approach something. Now, each of the previous knowledge structures we looked at, and each of these insights represent a kind of code, a way of thinking, and each code or insight is significantly different. Now, how did I use this in my research? Now, very briefly, I had 50 volunteers working as mechatronics technicians or technologists in 3 different types of automation environments. They completed a questionnaire describing their context, the most recent problem faced, and a technical description of how they solved a problem. I then selected 18 of 27 responses and conducted a second phase, a reenactment interview. This meant they took me through the actual problem with the real artifacts involved in that problem, which I video recorded. Now, the third phase involved getting their supervisors and my industry experts to verify my analysis. Now, I used the epistemic plane to map their approach to and analysis of the problem and the subsequent synthesis of a solution. In other words, I tried to surface the disciplinary basis of their problem-solving process. I looked at how they drew on the fundamental core disciplines and other knowledge as they engaged in this problem-solving process. I'm going to share a few key findings with you. Now, here we have a range of maps that demonstrate some of the problem-solving processes undertaken by different participants. Now, one key finding was that the scale of the environment dictated a preferred insight, a way of thinking. The larger the company, the more doctrinal the insight. In other words, practitioners tended to start here and be governed by the procedures in that context. A second key finding was that the more holistic problem solvers in the different environments displayed an anomalous high achievement in both mathematics and the logic-based subjects. Now, this is not common in this particular qualification. A third finding was that each of the different environmental types revealed a different problem-solving process pattern. In all cases, there was a multi-layered cause-effect relationship between the disciplines in the actual problem structure in relation to a particular problem solver in his or her problem-solving environment. Now, what emerges from the research is that successful problem solvers recognize the different disciplines and aspects of the problem and use explicit code-shifting techniques. They engage in practices in all 4 quadrants, and they shift consciously between them. Now, the technical language they use changes depending on the context, whether it's for a report or verbal update to their managers or a discussion between colleagues on a production line, for example. These successful problem solvers appear to take a macro view, taking into account the people, the situation, the principles and procedures of each aspect of the problem. This means that for every problem-solving situation, there are too many contextual variables for us to prepare our students. I do suggest in the research that we need to enable 2 things in our teaching. The recognition that the differences between disciplines are essential. They mean different ways of thinking, and by extension, different ways of teaching and learning. Secondly, we need to enable a more conceptual grasp of the reality and principles of different practice contexts. We cannot hope to mimic or simulate all the possibilities that our students will encounter. Now, what does this mean for us as academics in our conflicting paradigms and contradictory roles? Those different roles we play are like those different disciplinary bases in different contexts. Now, Bernstein talks about the relational idea, a golden thread, as it were, visible to all in the field and requiring relations across disciplinary areas. This relational idea is what underpins a guiding conceptual framework. Now let us look at how we can use the principle of such a guiding conceptual framework in our work, how it can help to shape our own code-shifting practices between our different roles. Each of our roles, teaching and learning, research and community engagement, is underpinned by different principles, procedures, people, and possibilities. But first and foremost, there is one overarching principle. All of these take time. I've seen far too many academics drowning because of a lack of consciousness about time itself. How much is needed for what, when, where, and how? The first step in our jobs is to realistically allocate time to absolutely everything you need to do. The classes you teach, material preparation, consultation, assessment, departmental meetings, research time, personal obligations. And here comes tip number 1. We all have access to an electronic calendar, and it is a valuable resource which too many of us waste. The two benefits of allocating specific time to specific types of work, such as this calendar example you're seeing over here, are firstly, these are like appointments with yourself, during which that particular task is all you need to worry about. In other words, by setting aside specific time ahead for your entire year, but certainly for the semester and the next months, you are helping yourself to focus and not worry about the chaotic, imaginary, or even real notebook to-do list. Secondly, by setting aside specific time and blocks of time in your calendar, it helps you identify what you do not have enough time for. When you have populated an entire month and semester, and you then see that you have still not allocated a realistic period for that paper or seminar or research reading or assessment process, you need to question your priorities or others' expectations. So now, with principle number 1 out of the way and usefully employing your electronic calendar, I'm going to look at our 3 core roles, and I'm going to apply the model, the problem-solving model, to one example from each. Let's start with teaching and learning. If we use the 5P model to examine our teaching and learning contexts, we might identify key elements in each of the aspects as follows. What are the principles underpinning our teaching and learning? What are the conceptions of learning with which we're working? Are we talking about deep or surface learning? There are times when surface is appropriate for some things, but there are other times where deep learning is what is required. That has implications for our procedures. What does our timetable look like? What kinds of assessment are we going to be using? Who are our students? What is their level? Are they first year or final year or postgrads? What colleagues are we working with? Are we solely responsible for the subject? Are we collaborating with other colleagues? That has implications as well for the procedures we use, for the principles underpinning what it is we're trying to accomplish. These features of our problem-solving situation have implications for the possibilities. What are our class sizes? If we have 200 students in a class, it's totally different from how you would work with 40 students, for example. Have tutorial times been allocated? Does the particular disciplinary basis of this curriculum require practicals? What are our resources? By using the 5P model to flesh out all the aspects, we can see and identify relationships between these in relation to what is particularly problematic. So let's say, for example, one case scenario. Large class and a packed curriculum, and there's not enough time to enable the kind of deep learning that you wish to encourage. There isn't enough student engagement. Students don't have the time to ask questions, and when you do make the time, they don't engage. Maybe you're overlooking a key resource, your students themselves. What about getting them to do some of your work? Help each other, answer questions, explain concepts, clarify procedures. Do you have additional resources to do that? Do you have enough tutors or mentors? Maybe you don't. One way to tackle this is to set up a group for your subject. Some lecturers use WhatsApp, others use Google Groups. So here is an example from my previous working environment of real student engagement in a group forum. This is a case of using real students to help each other. Setting up a forum which students manage themselves, where they're not afraid of asking for help or being judged for the kind of language they use. Setting up a group like this is easy. All it takes, trust me, is asking the class for a volunteer to set it up. There is nothing more empowering for a student, even a first-year student, than to be in a position to help someone else. And this is the first step towards building a community of practice. And it's a first step when you look at the elements you've laid out in your problem-solving model of identifying where the gaps are and what the possibilities are in terms of actually helping yourself and your students. Now, let's look at our second role, community engagement. Everything we do is located within a community. And if that community has a shared purpose and there are defined deliverables, then it's more than likely that we're busy with community engagement, despite the narrow way in which many of our institutions prefer to refer to this activity. One of the key challenges we all know here is time. Finding the time to get all the stakeholders together. And then when you have managed that, there's the question of information sharing. The number of emails that go back and forth trying to align people's schedules or circulate information can be debilitating. Now, using the same principle with the 5P model or the problem-solving model, one can identify the need for more effective information sharing, which people can manage in their own time. In other words, that they can access the information that you are sharing in their own time and contribute to that same information effectively. Using a shared resource platform. Many of my colleagues are using things like Dropbox, which is problematic in some cases, and Google Drive or other forms of shared platforms. One way is to set up an actual website with a shared folder drive. This not only effectively distributes information, but it becomes a central repository for the purposes of accountability. Right, now to move on to my particular favorite, research. Because it was in this role that I actually discovered the wealth of tools available that made my life a little easier. Now, given our collective lifelong learning ethic, whether we like it or not, we are always learning. Research moments are always present. If we want to improve our teaching, our communities, our lives. We're going to focus for today on formal research. Now again, we take our tool to unpack the features we want to consider and to identify particular problem areas and where the possible solutions lie. So, what are the principles underpinning our research? What is our particular research focus? What are the methodologies we're going to be using? What are the principles underpinning our deliverables? What are the ethics involved in our research? We all know that standard list of particular procedures. There is proposal writing, possibly there's even looking for funding or applications for particular qualification level. There's the literature review, there's data collection, there are procedures with regard to data analysis and writing up of our research. There are people in this equation. There are other researchers on whom we're going to have to draw. There are our research participants. There are our colleagues. There are our supervisors, our family. There is management to whom we're reporting. What are the possibilities in our equation? Do we have dedicated research time? What are our research tools? What kinds of resources do we have that open up the space of possibilities? What kind of support do we have? Is there a particular community in which we are conducting our research? Are there collaborators, colleagues, multiple researchers? Now, there are so many possibilities when conducting research, and although we seem to have such standard methodologies, sort of dictated by that procedures list, one aspect that I've seen postgraduate students really struggling with is accessing appropriate literature and navigating their online library systems, particularly when they are researching a multi-dimensional and multidisciplinary research topic. Our one secret weapon is indeed Google Scholar. Now you can use Google Scholar to locate just about every article or text ever written on the various aspects of your research question. And you can simply add these to your online library. Now this is excellent for a first phase literature review search. And as you refine your search terms in Google Scholar, you can create an alert so that you're alerted to every article written or uploaded to the internet. These alerts are sent straight to your inbox for when you have time to review them. Now, articles that you find useful can be downloaded, preferably with a standardized file naming system so that you can keep track of your literature. Now, I also used an online spreadsheet system when I initially started reading so as to make notes and color code key themes. Now, what's really useful about using such an online system is that you can share them with your supervisors and even refer to them collectively during remote supervision discussions. Now, the aim of this talk is not to sell Google. There are many alternatives. The point is that by applying the very conceptual framework from my own research to my own life and activities, I found a way to alleviate the constant stress of feeling that I had no control over my work, that there was simply too much to do. By setting aside specific blocks of time for specific activities, and then identifying the key elements, the principles, procedures, people, and possibilities implied in those specific activities, I could shift my thinking appropriately and remain focused. Reading the literature for your study, or meeting with a particular community, or marking assessments are fundamentally different kinds of activities requiring different tools, approaches, and forms of literacy. When we become more conscious of these differences and navigate between them productively, then we open up the space for innovation, the space to truly make a difference to the world in which we live. Thank you very much.